Good morning, everybody. My name is Julie O'Neill, and I come from Ireland, which is a very small island on the edge of Europe, the western edge of Europe. And sometimes we find ourselves looking towards the west, to the United States. For a long part of our history, we looked to our immediate neighbour, the United Kingdom, with whom we have a very long and very interesting and complicated shared history. And since I joined the Irish Public Service in 1972, at just about the same time as Ireland joined the European Union, our gaze turned more towards Europe and to seeing ourselves as a member of the European Union. More recently, we've begun to look even further westwards and to think very much about our relationship with Asia and in particular with China. What I'd like to do is very quickly talk through the headlines of my paper, which I circulated this morning, which I titled Europe More or Less, because I think the big question facing Europe is, will we have more of it or will we have less of it as the years go by? And I want to talk very briefly on these headings, which is Europe as a journey to an unknown destination, which we've talked about in recent days, about the widening and deepening of integration that has been taking place, about the extent to which the euro crisis has been a game changer in the future of Europe, where we might go with it now in the 21st century, and in that context, our role on the world stage, and the potential for a strategic partnership between the European Union and China. And I know that's a lot to get through in my 15 to 17 minutes, so I will be brief in my comments and maybe we can pick up some of the points in discussion. Just in terms of the European project, as we've been talking about it, we've talked quite a lot, and my colleague just now has talked about the history which led to the formation of the European Union, and I don't need to restate that, but I think some of the fundamental principles that underpin the Union are important and worth restating. And one is that it's a dynamic and a progressive process. It doesn't have a clear destination or a clear end point. Another is that it is based on free consent and the rule of law, and that fundamental issue that the European Union can only progress with the free consent of the member states and the populations of the member states is very important. And I think it's worth saying that the Franco-German leadership, which led to the establishment of the Union and at the heart of the Union, is very important still in determining its future direction, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. And I think we talked yesterday in one of the sessions about whether maybe the reasons which led to the formation of the Union any longer hold good. But I think it was Jean Monnet, one of the founders of the Union, which said that it was a process of change, that the sovereign nations of the past can no longer solve the problems of the present. They must learn to live together under common rules freely arrived at. And I would feel that while the reasons he might have said that back just after the Second World War are somewhat different to the position we find ourselves in today, that rationale still holds good. And his view was that nationalism had to give way to supranationalism, and that is one of the challenges that we face. If you look at what's been happening in terms of the deepening and the widening of integration since the Treaty of Rome in 1958, the Union has expanded on the basis of 6 further major treaties that have been entered into by the member states. The membership has grown gradually from 6 through 9, 10, 12, 15, 23, up to most recently 28 member states. It has evolved, as we've spoken of, as a common market, into a single market, into a single currency, with the economic and monetary union and the euro at its core. And I echo what Jürgen said just now, which is that focus has been primarily on the economic to date. But meanwhile, the policy agenda has broadened to include external action, which is quite important at the moment in terms of the growing role of the European External Action Service, and to address other broader issues such as climate change. And since 1999, the Eurozone has gradually become the de facto core of the European Union. It's the most tangible evidence of European integration. 17 of the 28 European Union countries have adopted the single currency, and every day some 332 million people use the euro. And when I think of myself as European, I think of the euro a change in my pocket, and I think that's part of the reason that this is associated with some of the tensions and the fragmentation that's occurring within the Union as we speak. Interdependence is deepened, not just in terms of the numbers of member states, but also in changes in the institutional structure and in the voting methods used by the institution. If you look, that's just a map of Europe at the moment. When Dr. Zhou Hong of the Chinese Association of Social Studies visited us in my institute in Ireland in June, she asked as a first question, how many Europes are there? And I think that's a very good question for anybody to ask from outside. And even looking at that map, where those in yellow are members of the European Union, with the slightly darker shade being those that joined more recently, you can see what a complex pattern Europe is. If you look at the organisational institutional structures we have, frankly, they can be difficult and complex, even for those of us who live in Europe, to fully understand. For those outside, I'm sure they must be bewildering at times. But we have gone from having a European Commission representing the interests of the Union and a Council of Ministers representing the Member States, to a now important role for the European Parliament representing the individual citizens of Europe, and a European Council which has limited powers but a very important role in directing the integration of Europe with other bodies on the side. So it's a very complex position that we find ourselves in. I want to turn briefly to the impact of the euro crisis. There is no doubt about it that it was the global financial implosion in 2008, and since then the euro area has been in the grip of deep turbulence, and that it was only then that the full extent of the growing divergence in the economic performance across the euro area and irresponsible practices in the financial sector came into sharp relief and became very evident. It also revealed the growing divergence in economic performance between the periphery of Europe and the core. That was there, it had been there for some time, but the true extent of it became very evident once the euro crisis began to take hold. And I think most importantly, the governments learned the hard way how far more interdependent their financial systems were than they realised. And that was a point Sir Malcolm made yesterday. Whether a country, a member state of the euro was inside, a member state of the European Union was inside the euro or not, it was affected by the financial crisis. And I think the ties and the tension between an interdependent financial area but highly decentralised policies exposed serious design flaws in the euro, which was also a point that Sir Malcolm made yesterday. The design flaws became apparent. In that context, it was the creditor countries, Germany in particular, that drove the agenda. I feel very comfortable sitting here today with a German on either side of me, because that's what it feels like for a small country like Ireland in Europe at the moment. We feel very much minded and watched over by our German colleagues. And that extent to which the creditor countries drove the agenda led to an area of unprecedented austerity and public discontent, which in turn has led to a loss of confidence and public trust. So what started out as a financial and economic crisis became a political crisis. And what is described by some as us facing the politics of constrained choice and shared sovereignty. I've just picked out some headlines which may not be easy to read, just from the Irish newspapers just before I left. The Troika, we've been part of the bailout in Ireland, seeking tough post-bailout terms. So the idea that just because we get out of the bailout that we regain our full sovereignty in Ireland, frankly, is unreal. We will always be subject to strong bailout terms. This is Siege of Rome, protests in Italy against high levels of youth unemployment. That tension is very evident around Europe, and you would see similar photos from similar cities, from other cities around Europe, from Athens, from Spain. So I suppose in that context, and given the huge challenge that Europe now finds itself facing, the question is, what happens next with Europe? And I suppose it's fair to say that the consequence of the political turmoil that ensued from the economic and financial turmoil has led to a fairly radical change in the political scenery right across Europe, with virtually every government that was in power at the outset of the crisis out of power once the crisis took hold, the notable exception being Chancellor Angela Merkel in Germany. And I think a feeling that change has been imposed by an unseen hand in Europe, which is echoing a point that Jürgen just made. It's been that's an unseen hand that doesn't have the confidence of individual citizens is making a lot of the decisions. And as I mentioned yesterday, this sense that the role of political parties to represent their people has become separated from the role to govern as part of a larger whole. And somebody described it to me recently as democracy in a straitjacket. And I think part of the reason now that one of the challenges we're facing now is for the euro area as a whole and Europe as a whole to become more responsive collectively to the people of Europe if it is to retain their confidence. And that's linked in with the point I made yesterday about the conversation needing to move on from a crisis of between the core and the periphery to one of interdependence. So what are we trying to do now within Europe? Stabilising the euro has become a critical challenge for the European Union. And under the leadership of Herman Van Rompuy, the President of the European Council, a roadmap for genuine economic and monetary union has been set out. And I think there is already significant progress being made in relation to banking union. I don't underestimate the challenges that lie ahead, but I do believe that those challenges are being met and that there will be an outcome in terms of a banking union. And I think the risk is that what will happen is the core countries that are members of the union will be part of that banking union, and those that are left outside may find themselves increasingly detached from what's happening. Addressing the divergence, a focus on growth and solidarity, is a huge challenge for the European Union. We have been better at tackling some of the economic issues and not so good at finding the political will to rebalance growth and to rebuild solidarity across Europe. And I suppose a big question for us is, will we see a transformation of Europe, either in terms of its fragmentation or a move towards a federal Europe, or will we see something more like a process of adaptation? Banking union is still a challenge. Here's a table produced by a colleague and friend of mine, Professor Bridget Laffan, who's at the Robert Schuman Institute in Florence in Italy for European Studies. And really one of the questions is, will we see a transformation in the sense of disintegration or United States of Europe, or will we see something more like a piecemeal adjustment or a move to something more of a functional federalism, which would be something less than a full United States of Europe, which is more of a process of adaptation? The European Union has been very good at muddling through in the past. Its politicians do well, and it's a reflection, I think, of the process of subsidiarity we have in Europe and the fundamental rule of subsidiarity. But I think there may be sufficient impetus and external pressure and crisis to move us closer towards a functional federalism. I want to turn briefly to Europe's role and values on the world stage. It'll be clear from what I've been speaking about, and it'll be clear from the discussion we've had here over the last 2 days, that most of Europe's attention has been focused inwards in the last few years. And that's inevitable for 2 reasons. One, because of the euro crisis, and also because of the growth in the number of member states. I think what we need to begin to look at more closely now is the role that Europe can play on the world stage, both in terms of global governance, and we are playing a part in trade, international finance and climate change, and also the growing foreign policy and security role through the European External Action Service, which Professor Sheng talked about earlier. And I think the important opportunity that the External Action Service provides for transformational change in Europe's foreign policy role, and for developing common cause and peace and prosperity, strategic relationships of understanding and trust. And I want to say just a little bit about the potential for an EU-China partnership, and I developed this more in my paper. I do believe that there is an opportunity and a challenge for Europe and China, which is grounded in shared values. I think it's time that Europe woke up and realised that China is a major driver of world economic growth, and that the Chinese dream, which is essentially a benign vision of China's role in the future, has significant implications for a world order. Europe and China has had an erratic history of partnership, if you could even call it that. But now it's more vital than ever. And just without going into them, if you look at the population comparison of Europe, China and the United States, you can see how important China is. If you can look at absolute GDP, you see that China still lags behind, as we said yesterday. But if you look at the rate of growth, the picture tells a very powerful story. And in terms of trade, Europe and China have a very significant have a very significant role together. So I would be hopeful that the measures now in place for improved dialogue, and as Europe begins to look outward, will lead to a restatement of that relationship and a strategic partnership emerging between China and Europe. I just want to finish with a few words in terms of conclusion. If I can just bear with me for a moment. I think, from my perspective, in a globally interconnected world, the countries of Europe are no longer able to steer the course of events alone. Even the biggest European countries run the risk of irrelevance compared with global giants like the US and China. And the paradox as I see it, and I say this as an Irish person and as a European, is that by sharing sovereignty, individual member states and Europe can be more sovereign in the world. And another paradox is that by reaching out to develop strong strategic relationships with China and other key players in the global economy, the evolution of the world economy can be more than the sum of its parts. I think the European Union has demonstrated the power of possibility and vision. And Spinelli once said it was one of the most important achievements of the European spirit. But perhaps it's time for us to learn from China. And the time has come for the leaders of Europe to restate the European dream in a way that resonates more emotionally with its citizens, because that's something I think we have failed to do. And I believe that in an increasingly globalised world, where power structures are shifting and evolving, the rationale for the Union is even more compelling than it was 56 years ago. And the challenges are arguably greater as we grapple with the complexities of greater scale and interdependence in the context of global economic crisis and a rapidly evolving world order. I believe that despite all the challenges, I don't believe Europe will disintegrate. I believe we will move ever closer, step by small step, because frankly I believe that it's unthinkable that we go back in another direction. I'd like to end with a Chinese proverb, which was given to me by a young Chinese friend of mine, and I can't translate it literally, but to me it means learning from one another and learning from the merits of others so that we can correct some of the faults and failings on our own side. And I think that this Beijing Forum is a really valuable opportunity for shared learning, not just between Europe and China, but between the 55 countries that are represented here. Thank you.